I'd like to welcome you to this online natural systems agriculture course. I will start sharing my slides in a minute, but I should just introduce myself. My name is Martin Entz. I'm a professor at the University of Manitoba. I hold the Jarislowsky Chair in Natural Systems Agriculture for Climate Solutions. So let me begin by sharing my slides. Um, I guess that means I have to press the right button. Right, here we go. Yeah, there we go. So this course is um, offered for the first time in 2025. And the course is being offered to graduate students at the University of Manitoba. But our work takes us to different parts of the world. And right now we're doing a lot of work in Eastern and Southern Africa, and also with farmers across Canada. And so there's an interest by those participants to take this course as a certificate course. And that is one of the reasons that's inspired me to put the lectures up on our YouTube channel and allow people access to the course by video link. So today is the introductory lecture. So the course is called Natural Systems Agriculture, and Module 1 is outlined here. First of all, let's locate ourselves. I am in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in the longitudinal center of Canada. Today, it's actually about minus 29 degrees Celsius outside. It's the second week of February. The University of Manitoba is located on Treaty 1 territory, and we have a land acknowledgement at the bottom, and also on the left-hand bottom of the screen, you can see a map of all of the treaties on the Great Plains of Canada, and Treaty 1 is just down there below Lake Winnipeg, and that's where I'm located. So in this module, I want to talk about really introduce the notion of natural systems agriculture. So I've got the outline here on the slide. We're going to talk about the agricultural revolution continuing, the problem of agriculture, the whole concept of nature-based solutions. We'll talk a little bit about more about the history of that in Module 2. Locating nature within agricultural systems. So we'll talk a little bit about a theoretical framework to do that, and then give some examples of nature-based processes within agriculture. All right. So when we look at Canadian agriculture since the time of the settlers, it very much mimics what happened in Northern Europe. And so if we look at Northern European agriculture, we went all the way from a two-crop rotation to a very diversified cropping system in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And it's a very elegant, ecological, highly diverse system. Along came Haber-Bosch nitrogen fertilizer, and that allowed us to simplify the cropping system again, the farming system again. So we went from a fairly simple system, and we've sort of done a big arc, and we're in some ways back to fairly simple cropping systems, but with other ways of enriching the soil. So just an example of how an agricultural system is continues this is a quote from Dr. David Connor at the University of Melbourne, and he really drilled this into me, and it stuck. It makes sense that if we looked at this slide here and we look at feeding pigs, if we go with grain, we can feed a few pigs. If we go with fodder beets, which are shown here, we can feed a lot more pigs. That's just an example of how the agricultural revolution continues. We're always looking for better ways of doing things. Now, the agricultural revolution also was alive and well in North America. And right here in the center of Canada, we had evidence that communities were consuming wild rice and back, uh, 1,500 years ago. And the earliest example of pre-contact native farming is just north of Winnipeg, and that was in 1400, where archaeologists have discovered uh, storage for maize and other crops. And then the climate changed, those indigenous communities moved south. We entered the fur trade era, and indigenous communities were farming once the buffalo had been wiped out. And so there's this evolution of agricultural happening here, uh, with the indigenous communities. And there's a lot of reasons why that agricultural system of indigenous communities was not sustained in a way that it could have. A lot of that had to do with residential schools and other harmful ways that indigenous people were treated. An exciting piece of proof that people were farming here a long time ago was actually the discovery of a bison scapula or shoulder blade hoe along the Gainsborough Creek in 2018. And Eric Olson was a student in my crop production class, and in the summer he stumbled upon this when he was doing a summer job in that part of the province, and that has actually become a fairly famous site. It's called the Olson site now, and archaeologists from the Brandon University in Western Manitoba have concluded that that site was like a major factory for making these hoes. So an exciting piece of information. Now, indigenous community cultures were involved in agriculture for, millennia. And this is an example from Hawaii. This is the Ahapua'a system of resource management. And I am told by the archaeologists that I encountered that these systems, which grow food in the ocean, in the taro ponds close to the ocean, in the breadfruit trees, and the fed by these mountains, and you've got other timber production up here, up to 1 million people in the Hawaiian Islands. So a very productive agricultural system that existed in pre-colonial times. And what I love about the Ahapua'a system is the person who was in charge of the system was the agroecologist. So that's a little bit of background on, the agricultural revolution and how it continues, but how we have this rich history from indigenous communities and other communities that we can build on. Okay, I'd like to turn the page on my lecture and talk a little bit about my teachers. These are people who have influenced me to understand it's not just about agronomy and production economics. The whole word agriculture has the word culture in it. And so it just needs to include so much more than just the straight up, economics. And the cultural involvement means understanding farmers like Don Jose in Honduras and P. Sainath, who's India's famous rural reporter. Grant McEwen, the former dean of our faculty, who loved conservation and wrote a fantastic book about 50 mighty women of the prairies. And that book was published, 40 years ago. So one of my teachers is Wes Jackson, who is the founder and past president of the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, a place that's going to celebrate its 50th anniversary next year in 2026. And when I heard him speak, when I was a graduate student at the University of Saskatchewan, he talked about the problem of agriculture. And that was completely foreign to us agronomists because we were used to hearing about the problem in agriculture. And so if you just do this, you'll fix the problem, it'll all be good. But he's saying, look, agriculture, like the plow combined with annual crops, has resulted in so much degradation of land and landscapes. And so we need to rethink agriculture. And the term natural systems agriculture is one that is very dear to Wes Jackson's heart. And just a little illustration how natural systems are so different than our cultivated systems. This is some work that we did together with Agriculture Canada scientists at Indian Head, Saskatchewan, and April Stainsby was looking at aggregate stability in the grassland areas and in the arable plots. And so we are really proud of the fact that when we grew cover crops, we increased the stability of the soil a little bit. But when you compare it to the native system, it's still less than half. And I think this illustrates very, very well. So Wes Jackson is has worked all over the world, and his Land Institute continues to do that on some exciting projects like perennial rice. We'll talk about that in the course. But a very good connection they had is with the Australians, and they wrote this monograph called Agriculture as a Mimic of Natural Ecosystems. And I read this 25 years ago, and that was one of the things that really got me hooked into this area of research. And so I started researching and doing teaching in this area. And then you run into so many interesting ideas about reimagining farm landscapes. So here's a very interesting scholar at the University of Michigan, Dr. Joan Nassar, who asks people to take a look at a landscape and then imagine what it would look like in your mind um, uh, to be more sustainable. And so it's not only a landscape ecology lab, but it's a landscape perception lab. And I think it's really exciting because, and especially in a country like Canada, where we have people from all over the world and everybody has an idea of what natural landscapes can look like. Okay, now in the course, I will from time to time show you this slide, and that is a pot of soil. And when you arrive at this slide in the YouTube video, you might want to pause it and think about your ideas and your questions and plant them in that soil. And then later on, we will take them out and look at them. So we're planting ideas. All right. Now comes the tough part. We're going to talk about some theory. I asked myself the question, how can we think about farming and the humans involved in farming and all the technology and all the things that are unknown and that we can't control? How do we sort of represent that in a model that might be helpful for us? And then I actually was in the Purdue University bookstore and I found a used copy of this book called An Introduction to Systems Thinking. I picked it up. It probably didn't cost very much. I still have the original copy. And Weinberg, who wrote the book, presented this systems thinking model. And I want to share it with you. So in the model, on the left-hand column, is randomness. And this yellow bar will disappear in a minute. And of course, you know, we want to have low randomness. We want to have some predictability. And on the x-axis, we have complexity. Okay, so on the left-hand side, things are not very complex. On the right-hand side, things are. So here's the model now without that yellow bar. So you have randomness here and complexity here. And we have three zones, one here, one at the top, and one in the middle. Now, Weinberg calls this model, this zone on the bottom left as organized simplicity. Things are not that complex, but they're fairly predictable. So machines, new crop varieties, you know, pesticides fit into this because you apply them to a pest, and unless that pest has developed resistance, that pest is going to die. And many of our machines in agriculture, they're amazing machines. Like a combine harvester has got just so many things, but it actually, in the context of the agricultural system, performs a relatively predictable um, task, and that is to separate the grain from the non-grain material, put it in a place where it can be shipped off and stored. Okay, so that's zone one. The zone on the top is what Weinberg calls unorganized complexity. This is where things are extremely random. Weather, commodity prices, uh, global events that are unpredictable, like conflict and economic circumstances that are thrust upon countries for one reason or another. And then the third and final zone is what Weinberg calls organized complexity. And this is the zone of systems. This is where farming and cropping systems are, and this is where farmers live. Okay? So I hope that model makes sense. So farmers are subject to these events out of the unorganized complexity zone, and they use the tools out of the toolbox to deal with those challenges. Now, this Weinberg model has helped me understand to locate myself. So when I talk about, fertilizer application to crops, and you add the fertilizer and you get a crop response, it could be a linear response, it could be a quadratic response. That is a predictable thing, and you can use statistics, regression to figure that out. Unorganized complexity, things like weather. How do we talk about the weather? We talk about the chances of precipitation, the chances of snowfall or rainfall. So we use probability analysis. So down here we use simple statistics. Up here we use probability analysis. Now the question is, how do we treat the area of systems mathematically? Well, there are all kinds of models that we can use, but the human has to be part of it, because we can't just use a calculator to figure out how to optimize all of the operations that we need to do on a farm, for example, in a particular week. So hopefully this model helps you with that. Okay, so organized complexity is partly statistical, which is science, and it's partly human management, which I'm calling here an art. So we need to understand the art and the science of this zone. And especially if we're going to introduce more natural processes into this zone, we have to bring voices in from many different places. And so at many universities, many places, we invite farmers to actually help us teach students, because they have that lived experience, which is so important. All right. So the next question is, where's the best place to be in that zone? Where's the best place to be within this zone of systems? Well, I would argue that we want randomness to be low. We want to have fairly predictable systems. So we don't want a lot of randomness. And so how do we drive down that randomness? Science would tell us that one of the really great ways to do that is to increase the complexity or increase the diversity. So now I've replaced randomness with stability. So to increase stability of the system, we need to increase the diversity. And that is something that scientists and people who live on the land have observed, that when you have more diversity, there's a good chance you'll have a more stable, sustainable system. So where we want to be in this zone is probably down here in the bottom right. And that means we have to harness diversity. Now, diversity comes from nature. Not always. We can have diversity of markets. We can have diversity of strategies for pest control, which could involve drones and AI. But on the biological side, it really comes from nature. And that's one of the reasons why natural systems agriculture is so exciting because it allows us to employ that diversity. But in the context of a farming system where we also manage it, it's not a completely natural system. Okay. All right. So that's a lot to take on board. And you may have questions and you may have ideas. Um, Please put them in the soil and let them grow. And I will tell you at the end of the lecture how we deal with those exciting ideas that have come your way. Okay, let's move on to the next section. Ecological thinking in managed systems. So I want you to think now about that middle zone of the Weinberg model. And we talked about diversity helps us to reduce randomness or increase stability. Let's look at that a slightly different way. And I'm borrowing here from that book that Wes Jackson and his colleagues from Australia wrote 25 years ago. The first rule is humans are part of the system. The second rule is that we need a common currency, and energy is very, very important there. Energy flow in natural systems is self-regulated, and so on. I'm going to actually show you examples of each of these 7 points. So the first one, humans are part of the system. And lucky us, we get to be part of producing food and looking after the ecosphere. We'll talk a lot in this course about management by humans. One of the important ways of thinking of humans as part of the system is that if we create a system that is stable, that allows people to have livelihoods, which means jobs, which means income. And in many parts of the world, where most of the population is involved in agriculture, giving people a choice to stay on a profitable food producing farm is really important. This is a picture of farmers in Nicaragua, and they are very good farmers. They have about 10 hectares, and it's because of their ecological practices that they can grow crops profitably with minimal cash input, and it gives them the choice then to stay on the land because the alternative is not always pretty. And so that is something that applies to certain parts of the world where a sustainable, profitable, ecologically sound agriculture can give people choices that might help them live their lives. And people are also living in harmony with agriculture. So when pesticides, for example, are sprayed, they are going to contact people, and that can have consequences. And so you can pause at any time and you can look at this data more carefully. But I just wanted to make the point that that we are not doing agriculture in a vacuum. And in some cases, in some parts of the world where pesticides are poorly regulated, they can have devastating effects. For example, on the right, young children living in the valleys where agricultural pesticides were used intensively in Mexico, their cognitive ability is not as good as the young people living in the foothills where pesticides in use intensity is lower. And the way we raise our food can affect the quality of the food and the healthfulness of the food. And we'll talk about this in the future. The second rule is that a common currency is required, and we use energy for that purpose. So think thermodynamics, but it's basically we measure things in energy. So what do we use to measure energy? Joules or megajoules are very, very good. We use them all the time in agriculture. And what is a megajoule? Well, if you've ever ordered out and food and you get a little container of some kind of sauce, um, that's a 30 milliliter container. If you fill that with gasoline at the pump, that's 1 megajoule. So that gives you an idea of what roughly a megajoule of energy is. Okay, so that's a fairly easy thing to think about. And then we do a lot of ratios in agriculture, like how much energy are we getting in terms of food production for every unit of energy, of fossil fuel energy going into the production system, whether it's fuel to run our equipment, fuel to make the equipment, fuel to make the fertilizer, especially nitrogen. And so you get all these ratios here. And in Canada, we're looking at about 8 to 1, maybe 9 to 1 units out for every megajoule going in. So we have a ways to go in terms of efficiency. And then if we look at how we can produce energy for agriculture, these are just some ratios here that are helpful to know about. So if we look at oil, it's about 20 to 1. It takes us 1 unit of energy to get 20 units out. If we look at ethanol here, we can look at biodiesel, wind, hydro. So, this helps to inform you to let us know more about energy. And then the other metric that is of interest is how much gross domestic product can we produce per unit of energy. So this graph on the right here shows the energy use per unit of GDP, or gross domestic product. And of course, we want to have as little energy required to make the economy. And so I'll tell you that the countries that are the most efficient are Germany, England, and Denmark, for example. They are very efficient at generating GDP per barrel of oil. Now, you may remember, but you probably don't, and that's just fine. One of my teachers was E.F. Schumacher. E.F. Schumacher wrote the book Small is Beautiful, which I read in my 4th year undergraduate. And I didn't know at the time, or I didn't dawn on me, that he was the former chair of the British Coal Board. So he was all about, big time fossil fuels. And he wrote a book which, critiqued big industry. And so he said the exclusion of wisdom from economics, science, and technology was something we could perhaps get away with for a little while as long as we were relatively unsuccessful. But now that we have become successful, the problem of spiritual and moral truth moves into the central position. So what he's really saying is humans are very successful now. We basically run the planet, right? We use most of the arable land to produce food. We fish the oceans. We put greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And so that's really what he means by successful. And so we need to think about morals. And then he writes, from an economic point of view, the central concept of wisdom is permanence. Nothing makes economic sense unless its continuance for a long time can be projected without running into absurdities. So great quote. Let's just let that soak. Just let that soak into your brain. Pause the video, go back and read it. I think there's some great instructions there. I've included it talking about energy because E.F. Schumacher was the former chair of the British Coal Board. Now, we've done a lot of energy work, and here's Ann Kirk on the bottom right and Iris Vaisman on the top left. And these are former grad students. And we created what we called the Sunshine Farm in Manitoba. And we actually got the energy efficiency up to 14 to 1. And our goal is 45 to 1. So we haven't gotten there yet, but we've certainly improved over conventional production and with a fairly competitive agricultural net return. Okay, number 3, energy flow in natural systems is self-regulating. And if we look on the left here, we can see the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle starts at the sun. The sun brings that energy into brings those photons of energy into green plants where there's chlorophyll, and that creates photosynthesis, and that results in those green things going down. That's the carbon going into the soil plant system. Now the open circles, that's soil respiration. Every now and again we lose some carbon naturally. The soil is burping, essentially. The microbes are releasing some of that carbon. And then we've got the water cycle that cycles in there as well. And this is a great illustration about how energy flow is self-regulating. And so, of course, in agriculture, we interrupt this natural self-regulating flow because we actually harvest some of the photosynthetic products from that system. And so that is a little bit our dilemma, and it's also our great pleasure because we get to make food. Now, the sun is really so central to this, and if we look at Canada, especially the plains of Canada, where we're doing most of our work right now, there's abundant solar energy. And so that allows us to really think about, can we maximize photosynthesis and capture more carbon? And that's what these authors are talking about here is let's not limit the amount of photosynthesis that we can achieve. So here we have some data from a former grad student looking at the photosynthetic capture by measuring the above ground growth of plants from April till middle of October. And there's really the opportunity to capture carbon pretty well for the entire 5 months if we grow the right combination of crops. And so that's what we're starting to think about. We know that these flows are self-regulating. Can we just put crops on the ground that allow us to capture that self-regulating energy in the sense of carbon? If we look at the tropics, this is the zone of the world that's the tropics, and things are very different there. Instead of having a warm and a dry and a cold season like we do here in Canada, the tropics have a dry and a wet season, or a dry and maybe two rainfall seasons. And in the tropics, people have known for a long time the idea of trying to maximize the capture of carbon through mixed planting and polyculture. And so, the example here on the right, the milpa or the three sisters, the maize, beans, and squash. This is very widely celebrated. But on the left here, you can see there's all kinds of different polyculture systems that are adapted to different niches in the tropics. And the emphasis is on photosynthesis. Have something green all the time. And this is another one of my teachers. I do not know this woman's name, but we visited a farming project in Kenya, and we were interested in cover crops, what crops could be grown with the maize that would continue to grow, provide ground cover, and maybe even enrich the soil with nitrogen after the maize was harvested. One of the crops that we were interested in was lablab. And here was a farmer, and she had spontaneously, all by herself, figured out, got a hold of some lablab and made it work. And she showed us her plot, and it was so impressive. And, this not only emphasizes photosynthesis, but it emphasizes innovation at the farm level. Okay, the fourth point is that now it gets a little bit more complicated. The stability and sustainability of energy flow in natural systems is regulated by mutualistic processes. Okay, so mutualistic processes is when two organisms help each other. So one of the real good examples is bees and flowers. The flowers give the bee some pollen, which is protein for the bee, and the bee, uh, in turn, moves the pollen from the male to the female parts of the plant, allowing the plant to reproduce. So that's mutualism in action. And the clownfish in the sea anemone, you might have seen that in like grade 5 science. Great example. Okay, now we're not quite done. So mutualistic process and evolution has pushed these natural systems toward mutualistic processes that have higher efficiency. Okay, what that means is that through natural selection and millennia of creation, we have of evolution, we have these mutualistic systems being highly efficient. So they help each other and they're super efficient. That is something that's really great to try to mimic in an agricultural system. Now, for agronomists, one of the real emblematic types of um, examples of mutualism is nitrogen fixation, where bacteria in the soil lives in the nodules of the plant, and it brings the nitrogen from the atmosphere into the plant, and it's made into protein. So if you eat pulses, and they're very high in protein, that protein is ultimately coming from the atmosphere, which is 78% nitrogen, and the bacteria are critical to fixing that. And the bacteria, sorry, can do this because the carbon for the bacteria is coming from the plant. All right. I'm going to skip this one. We'll get to that in the future. So just as a contrast, the mutualistic experience here of the bacteria with the plants to make high protein plant material really emphasizes a natural process that we should try to employ. And right now we're using a lot of natural gas to make nitrogen fertilizer. Basically by the same process, we're taking it out of the atmosphere and putting it in a little pellet. But it takes tremendous amount of energy. And you might be surprised to know that this is the most carbon intensive part of the farming system, is the manufacture of nitrogen fertilizer. It's much more energy intensive than the diesel fuel used to run that massive equipment. When we look at, just amazing examples of mutualistic farming systems, here's one from India. So the farms are growing rice, they're growing legumes, and they're growing maize. And those crops are being fed to goats. And those goats live in this house. And there's no floor, there's just slats. And so they will eliminate their nutrients and they will plop into the water. And they'll pollute the water and cause weeds to grow. Those ducks can eat those weeds. Now, those ducks are also going to eliminate nutrients, and those nutrients are going to sink into the bottom of the pond, and they can cause E. coli and all kinds of nasty diseases. But these tilapia fish can eat those eliminations, and they can detoxify. They are naturally resistant to those bacterial infections. So that is pretty cool. Now, some of that grain is also fed to dairy cows, and they produce milk, which is important for protein and all kinds of micronutrients and macronutrients. And the dung from the animal can be put into an anaerobic digester, which can be used to produce energy to light a home or to provide some heat for cooking. And then the leftovers from the biodigester can go into these vermicomposting. I know this is too good to be true, right? These vermicomposting channels, and the worms can be introduced there to process that leftover material, and it can be fertilizer, which can be put back on the crops. So this is an example of, multiple mutualistic processes that have evolved, and that we need to scale up in agriculture so they can be applied at not only a smallholder farm scale in India, but also a large scale in a place like Canada. Now, here's another example of one of those farming systems that's really focusing on mutualism. It's the fish Azolla duck rice system. Not a very good picture, but this is a rice paddy, and the Azolla, which is water fern, nitrogen fixing, grows in there. The ducks eat that, and the fish coexist with this whole system. And so there are many, many examples of this around the world. I'm just sharing some of the information that a former grad student shared with me. This is work in West Asia. And here the farmers are looking at trying to put some mutualism into cropping systems by growing, trees amongst the crops. And so sometimes by multi-cropping, and so sometimes mutualism, it takes many different forms. That previous picture I'm skipping over, but one of the, I'll come back to it later in the course, but one of the things I just wanted to show is that in many parts of the world, certainly in the grassland of the Great Plains, the prairies of Canada, the steppes of Ukraine, and other places in the world, of China and South America, the natural plants actually grew very deep. And so this is 7 meters. So these plants are extremely deep. This is from actually a dig in Nebraska. This is by Weaver in 1919, over 100 years ago. And so when we think about mutualism, we need to think about, the whole profile, and all kinds of things jump into our imagination. Okay, number 6. The stability and sustainability of all systems may be enhanced by maintaining species and landscape biodiversity. So this little example here from Kristen McMillan, a colleague in my department, shows that when you grow peas with not by themselves, but either as an intercrop with canola or flax or oats, the infestation of the pea aphid is significantly reduced. And this is just an example of how diversity helps to make the system more sustainable. And we could probably find, dig deeper in this system, and we'll do that in the course. And the diversity not only creates stability ecologically for the plants, it can also create stability within communities by actually increasing nutritional security. And so we'll talk a lot about intercrops and diversity in areas where climate change is already affecting food production significantly, but there is great hope in stabilizing that and enhancing it through diversity. And I love to look at this picture of this painting from 1886 from France, and we can see one of my favorite crops, which is oats, but we can see a diversity of crops. And so clearly the French farmers back 150 years ago or so were already embracing diversity by doing strip intercropping. So the final point is that despite the cost of transition to natural systems agriculture, there is an urgent need to proceed. And that is something that there are many voices to support that. But here we have the list of ecologically thinking in managed ecosystems. And so when you hear examples in this course and when you're thinking about things that you're doing in your work, try to figure out which of these 6 or 7 really are being emphasized. Okay, so let's take a breath, put our ideas into the pot of soil so they can grow along with other people's ideas, and we'll pull those ideas out later on in the course and discuss them and share them, grow alongside them. Okay, I want to end the first module by sharing an example of how Canadian farmers are applying natural systems agriculture to what I would call real world problems. So this is a farm family, and I'm just showing the men here because that's the picture that I have of farmers in Southern Ontario, and they have 3-gen organics. You could go to the website and learn more, but we have been working with these farmers for a number of years, and they've done a terrific job of educating our students on their practice. And so we've got Brett Israel is here, and he has been the person that's interacted with our students the most. And I just want to show you some of the things that they're doing on their farm, which I think are pretty big steps to embracing natural processes, mutualistic processes. So this is a farm where it's a certified organic farm, so they've eliminated pesticides and synthetic fertilizers. They raise pigs and they raise crops, and they harvest maize, corn, and feed it to their pigs, and they do all the things that farmers do. Now, one of the surprises for a lot of the students is that pigs actually like eating alfalfa. And I remind the students that like us, pigs are omnivores. They don't only eat, they can eat all kinds of different things. And so at 3-gen Organics, they feed alfalfa to the gestating sows, and that can reduce their grain consumption by 40%. And more than that, it allows them to grow a deep-rooted plant like alfalfa in the crop rotation, which mimics that, those deep prairie roots that I showed you earlier. And so by shifting the diet, they've also been able to improve their land management by introducing a perennial that has very deep roots and is a nitrogen fixing plant. Brett also tells us that the sows really like it. It makes them healthy. And he also made the point that in their production, the pigs spend quite a bit of time outside. That's part of the organic standard. And he made the point that sunlight is very good for the health of the pigs. And that is in contrast to many modern conventional pig barns where the animals never see the light of day. Now on 3-gen Organics, you've got the feeder barn here, and you can see the outdoor access areas. Now that produces a lot of solid manure, and they also produce liquid manure, and they separate them. And then that allows them to be strategic in moving those nutrients from those manures onto the land. So solid manure will contain a lot of phosphorus. So can liquid manure. Manure should always be tested before it's applied so you know what you're dealing with. There are labs that actually test the nutrient content of manures. And then they can use precision spreaders to put the manure on. And the liquid manure is pumped between the corn rows, very much like conventional farmers use anhydrous ammonia, which is the high fossil fuel input form of nitrogen. And so just a very practical example. Here's the machine. that knifes the liquid manure between the rows of the corn, and it's it's very scientific, but it's based on ecological principles. Now, one other thing that really impresses me about 3Gen Organics is they've thought about their soil health in different ways. Um, this is an illustration of how damaging soil compaction can be to crop growth. So this is from our Carmen Research Center diagnostic school, where the teachers there have deliberately compacted an area and then grown crops and demonstrated how devastating that soil compaction is to the crop growth. And what they do, and compaction really comes from these big machines. But this kit that they have on the tires of this machine allow them to deflate the tires when the machine is on the soil, and that spreads that weight across a bigger area, and it has a very useful contribution to reducing compaction. So that it's a very sophisticated machine, and it uses all these pumps, but it really helps to maintain the integrity of the soil. And maybe a final feature of the 3Gen Organics is that they grow cover crops. So this is the maize sort of mid-season. You can see the maize is still very green, and there is a cover crop coming up. And then later on at crop maturity, the maize or the corn is ready to harvest, and the land is still being enriched with carbon and maybe nitrogen if they're growing a legume in here in this mixture of plants to bring that photosynthetic, that natural energy into the soil to feed the soil biology. And I want to end with this slide here, which was shared by Brett a few years ago. There was the top picture is their fields that grow a cover crop after the crop harvest, and the picture on the bottom is a neighbor field where they sort of use a standard practice of plowing in the fall and then leaving the soil completely exposed. And they had an early winter thaw in December of 2021. And Brett is asking the question, which land would you rather farm? And which land looks more like how nature might farm that land. So that is it for the lecture today. I'm going to end here for Module 1. Again, think of your ideas, write them down, think of your questions, write them down, plant them into this hypothetical little bowl of soil, and we'll let our ideas grow. Now, a few housekeeping points. Those of you who are in the course taking it at a certificate level, that means you are not taking it for university credit, you're just taking it out of interest, or you want a certificate of participation. I have all of your emails. I have all of your contact information, and you will be getting a couple of questions to answer after each module. And you don't have to give perfect answers, but you have to make an attempt, and you have to be part of the conversation, and that allows you to actually earn that credit. So I'm going to wish you all a good day or good evening or good morning, wherever you are, and we will see you in Module 2. I'm now going to stop sharing.